They told it around Larkin's Ford that Silas Crowder could follow a man across bare rock in the dark, that he'd once tracked a horse thief 200 miles and found him by the smell of a cold campfire 3 days dead. I knew better than most whether it was true, because I rode beside him for 11 years, and I never saw him lose a trail. Not once. Which is why, that first hard winter on the Grey Willow, when the word came down to the Ford that they'd found the great Silas Crowder face down and frozen near to death in a snowbank up in Sweetgrass Hollow, found by the very people the army would have sent him to hunt, not a man in that saloon believed it. I believed it. I'd seen the thing in him that the stories left out. My name is Bram Teague, and I'm an old man now with a stove that won't draw right and knees that tell the weather better than any almanac. But I can tell you about Silas Plain because we were green together, two boys who'd signed on as scouts for the column out of Fort Halloran when we didn't have the sense to know what we were signing. I was good. Silas was something else. Where I read sign, he read minds. He'd kneel in the dirt and study a scuffed track and tell you not just where a man had gone but what he was thinking when he went, that he was favoring his left leg, that he'd stopped to listen and was afraid, that he'd doubled back because he'd lost his nerve. The officers loved him for it. They called him the finest tracker on the plains, and they were not wrong, and it was the worst thing that ever happened to him. Because a man that good at finding people gets used to find people, and the army did not always want them found for kind reasons. I won't lay out every hard mile of those years. It's enough to say that Silas and I were riding lead the spring they sent the column toward a camp on the Bitter Fork, a quiet camp, women and old men and children, a band that had done nothing but winter where they'd always wintered. Silas read the country ahead of us for 2 days, and on the third morning, with the column waiting on his word, he stood up out of the grass, looked the major in the eye, and said he would not lead them another step. I remember the silence. I remember the major's face going from red to white. Silas didn't shout. He never shouted. He just said, real quiet, "I find men for a living. I'll not find them for you to do this." And he unbuckled his army belt and let it drop in the dirt and walked to his horse and rode out, north, alone, and I stood there a coward and watched him go and did not follow him for another 2 years. They court-martialed him in his absence. It didn't take. A man can't be made to track, and the army figured it out the hard way, and after a while they stopped looking for him, the way you stop looking for a tool you've broken. He went up into the Grey Willow country and built a cabin on Cedar Creek and ran a trap line, and that's where he was near a decade on, when the storm came that ought to have killed him. By then I'd mustered out and bought into the trading post at Larkin's Ford, 2 days' ride south of him, and we'd patched our old friendship back together one season at a time. He'd come down twice a winter to sell his furs and sit at my fire and say maybe 40 words across 3 days. He'd gone gray at the temples. He had a stillness on him that wasn't peace. I want to be honest about that. It was the stillness of a man who'd put something down so heavy he was afraid to look at his own hands. He never spoke of the Bitter Fork. He never spoke of much. He lived alone on purpose, the way some men drink on purpose to keep from feeling the size of a thing. I'd long thought he'd die that way. Alone, quiet, the best at a thing he hated, frozen out in some draw with nobody to read his last trail. The storm that nearly proved me right rolled down off the North Range 3 weeks early that year, a blue norther with no manners at all. Silas was out on the high line of his trapline when it hit, a full day's walk up Cedar Creek from the cabin. He told me later he saw it coming and started down and knew the whole time he wasn't going to beat it. The wind came first, then the snow came sideways, and then the world went white and there was no up nor down nor north in it. He said it was the strangest feeling of his life. For the first time since he was a boy, Silas Crowder could not read the land. The finest tracker on the plains stood in a whiteout with his own backtrail filling in behind him faster than he could make it, and he was, in the plainest sense, lost. He pushed on by feel. He found the creek by the sound of water under ice and followed it the wrong way in the dark, a thing he'd have known better than to do on any other day of his life. And somewhere in the black he stepped where there was no ground and went down a cut bank, and a deadfall caught his leg and twisted it bad, and he lay there in the drifts with the snow coming down on him like a quilt being pulled up over a sleeping child. He told me he wasn't afraid. He told me, and this is the part I've turned over in my mind 1,000 nights since, that lying there with the warmth going out of him, what he felt mostly was that it was about right. That a man who'd done what he'd done with his eyes ought to lose them to the snow. That a man who'd found so many people for the wrong reasons ought to be the one nobody found. He was wrong about that. He was about to be found by the last person on earth he had any right to expect. Her name was Tally, and she was the one they sent out into weather like that because she could read it. I have to be careful here, because I'm an old white man telling a story about people the world told a great many lies about, and I'd sooner cut my tongue out than add to them. So I'll tell you what I came to know firsthand, over the years, sitting at their fires as a guest and learning to keep my mouth shut and my eyes open. The band that wintered in Sweetgrass Hollow was maybe 40 souls under a headman named Otto, and they were not a legend or a symbol or a backdrop for a white man's redemption. They were people. They argued about where to camp. They had a man named Pell who told stories so long that the children would fall asleep, and he'd keep telling them anyway. They had a grandmother named Nicoma with a tongue like a skinning knife who could make Otto himself go quiet with one look. They laughed more than any company I ever kept. And among them Tally was the one whose word on the weather and the land was final, because she was simply the best of them at it. Better, I will say plainly, than Sela's ever was. She was a healer by her main trade, and a reader of country by the gift that came with it, and she'd gone out ahead of that storm not to wander, but to bring in 2 boys who'd taken the horses too far up the hollow. She found the boys. She was bringing them down when she crossed a track in the new snow that had no business being there. A big man, alone, on foot, hurt, going the wrong way along the creek. Now here is a thing the stories never tell you, and it's the truest thing I know about that whole winter. Tally did not have to follow that track. She had 2 cold boys in her own life to think of, and the man at the end of that sign was, by his boots and his bearing, a white man, very likely a soldier or a hunter, very likely the kind of man whose people had given hers nothing but grief. She owed him nothing. She could have brought her boys home and let the snow do what the snow does. She followed it anyway. She sent the boys down with the horses, and she went up the creek alone into a whiteout that had already beaten the finest tracker on the plains, and she read the country he couldn't, and she found him under his quilt of snow with the warmth nearly gone out of him, and she got him up. How a woman half his size got a 200-pound man out of a cutbank and down a mountain in a blizzard, I will not pretend to fully understand. She used the land. She used a travois lashed from deadfall and a line and the slope itself, and her own flat refusal to let him quit on her. He came in and out of his senses the whole way down, and he told me that the one thing that held him to the world was a voice he didn't know, speaking words he didn't understand, in a tone he understood perfectly. The tone you'd use on a fool who's decided to die, and whom you have decided is not going to. She got him to the camp near dawn. And that is where the easy part of this story ends, because finding a half-dead army scout is one thing, and the question of what to do with him is another thing entirely. And on that question the people of Sweetgrass Hollow did not agree. Tally's brother was a man named Hesse, and Hesse did not want Silas Crowder in that camp, alive or dead. I came to know Hesse well in later years and to count him, eventually, a friend, and I tell you he was right to feel as he felt. Hesse had reasons. He'd been at the bitter fork, not the camp Silas refused to lead the column against, a different camp, an earlier sorrow, the kind of sorrow that a man carries in the set of his jaw for the rest of his life. Hesse looked at the unconscious white man on the robes in his sister's lodge, and he did not see a man to be pitied. He saw a uniform he'd long ago learned to fear, a pair of eyes that found people for the army's purposes, a tool that had been pointed at his own kin. He said, and I think he was the only one brave enough to say it plain, that the kindest thing and the safest thing might be the same thing, and it was not to nurse this man back to health. Tally heard him out. She did not shout him down. From what I was told, she let the whole camp say its piece around the fire that morning while Silas lay senseless in her lodge, and there was a great deal said. There were those who agreed with Hesse. There were those who feared that if the man lived and went home, he'd lead others back to a hollow that had stayed hidden and safe precisely because no soldier's map had ever marked it. That was no small fear. It was the realest fear they had. And there were those, Nakoma chief among them, who said a thing that I have thought about for 30 years. The old woman said, and I have it as near to her words as I can carry it, by way of Tally, who later told me much of this, that a people who let the cold decide who lives become the cold. That they had been hunted by men who decided some lives were not worth the trouble of keeping, and that the day they started deciding the same was the day they'd lost the only thing those men had never managed to take. She said the man could be watched. She said the man could be questioned when he woke. She said the man could even in the end be sent away, or worse, if he proved to be what Hesse feared. But she would not have it said that her granddaughter dragged a living man down a mountain so that her own people could finish what the snow had started. It was not Nakoma's decision to make, and she didn't pretend it was. It was Tally's, because Tally had found him and Tally was tending him, and in that camp the one who took up a burden held the say over it. And Tally decided he would live if he could. Hesse walked out of that fire and did not speak to his sister for a long while, and I want you to understand that he was not the villain of this, and neither was she. They were two people who loved each other and had looked at the same hard world and come to different ends about what it asked of them. That happens in families. It happened in that one. So Silas Crowder lived. He woke on the second day in a lodge that smelled of wood smoke and crushed herbs, with his bad leg splinted straight and bound with a skill he said outshone any army surgeon's, and a woman sitting across the fire from him, watching him with no warmth in her face at all and a knife in easy reach. The first thing the finest tracker on the plains did, upon waking among the people he'd spent his youth being aimed at, was understand exactly where he was and exactly how little he was owed. He told me he lay there a long time and said nothing, and she said nothing, and the fire popped between them. And then he did the only thing he could think to do, which was to tell her the truth. He couldn't speak her tongue, and she had only a little of his, traded at the ford over the years, but he found the words slow and plain. He told her he knew what he was. He told her he'd been a scout. He told her, and this cost him, I know it did, about the morning on the column when he'd put his belt in the dirt. He didn't tell it to make himself look good. He told it because he figured he owed these people his whole hand, face up, before they decided what to do with him, and if the worst they decided was the worst, then he'd have at least died with the book straight. Tally listened. She'd understood maybe half the words and all the meaning, the way she'd understood his voice in the storm. And when he was done, she got up and ladled him a bowl of broth and set it in his hands, and that was her whole answer, and it was answer enough. She did not forgive him anything. There was nothing of hers for him to be forgiven, but she fed him, and a man who has braced himself to be killed and is handed a bowl of broth instead does not forget it as long as he lives. The healing was slow, on account of the leg, and slow was the making of everything that came after. Silas could not travel for the better part of 2 months. The hollow was snowed in solid. Nobody was going anywhere. So the most dangerous tracker on the northern plains spent the dead of that winter learning to be useless, and then learning, by inches, to be useful in ways that had nothing to do with finding men. He was watched at first, and he knew it. And he made it easy to be watched. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't ask a single question about the lay of the hollow or the trails in and out. And Hesse, who watched him hardest of all, was the first to notice that, and it was the first crack in Hesse's certainty. A scout casing a camp asks about the trails. This one never did. This one asked, when he could ask anything, how a certain snare was tied, because he'd never seen it done that way and it was better than his. He asked Nakoma what the bundle of dried root was for that she kept hanging by the smoke hole. He asked the long-winded man, Pell, to tell him the story again. The one the children fell asleep in the middle of because Silas, it turned out, never fell asleep, and Pell loved him for it forever after. What I'm telling you is that Silas Crowder, who'd been the best in the world at studying people in order to use them, slowly turned that same terrible gift to a wholly different purpose, which was simply to know them. To learn them the way you learn a country you mean to live in rather than pass through. And a man's gift, it turns out, is not the thing itself. It's only an edge. You can put an edge to skinning or to murder. The edge doesn't care. Silas had spent his whole life believing his edge had damned him, and that winter he found out it was just an edge, and that he could choose, every single day, what to lay it against. And there was Tally. I'd be lying if I made it a thunderclap. It wasn't. It was the slowest thing I ever watched grow, and I only watched the tail of it in the spring when I rode up worried half to death about a friend I'd thought was buried, and found him instead sitting in the sun outside a lodge mending a snowshoe frame with a woman beside him doing the same, the two of them not talking, easy in it, the way you're only easy with someone after a long winter of small honesties. By then they could trade more words. She'd taught him some of hers and he'd taught her more of his, and the teaching itself was the thing. You understand those hours of pointing at the fire, the snow, the splint on his leg, the names of things. Two grown people building a bridge plank by plank out of the only lumber they had, which was patience. She'd seen him at his lowest, hauled him off a mountain like a sack of meal, watched him tell the truth when a lie would have served him better. He'd seen her be right about everything and gracious about none of it, watched her hold her ground against her own brother for the sake of a stranger's life, watched her hands at her healing work, and learned that the steadiest, surest competence he'd ever seen in a human being lived in a woman his army had taught him to think of as something less. Each of them had met the other at the place where a person can't pretend. You can't pretend dragging a man down a mountain. You can't pretend dying. What grew between them grew out of ground that had already had every lie burned off it. I want to say clearly, because the world is coarse about these things and I won't be. It was a tenderness, and it stayed a tender thing, slow and held and deeply respectful, the kind that two adults come to by their own free choosing and in their own good time. He never once forgot whose camp he was a guest in. She never once was anything but the master of her own door. Whatever was said between them in the end was said behind it and stays there, and is no business of mine or yours. I only know that by the time the snow went off the high passes, the question in that hollow was no longer whether Silas Crowder would be allowed to leave. It was whether he'd want to. The thing that decided it, the thing that put it past all doubting, came that next autumn, and it came in a shape Silas knew too well. A survey party pushed up into the Grey Willow country, engineers and a few soldiers as escort, and trailing along behind for the money in it, a crew of hide hunters. They were mapping for a road that didn't need to go where they meant to put it, and the hide men were killing for the killing's sake, the way that breed did, and between the two of them they were headed, by the lay of the land, straight toward Sweetgrass Hollow, which had stayed safe and hidden for one reason only. No map had ever marked it. Silas saw the sign of them 3 days before the camp would have. Of course he did. He was the finest tracker on the plains, and that gift, which had once been aimed at people like the ones now sleeping in the lodges behind him, woke up in him like an old dog hearing a familiar step. He read the survey crew off the country the way other men read a letter. He knew their number and their pace and their purpose, and roughly the day they'd top the divide and look down into the hollow and put it forever on a piece of paper. Here is where the old Silas, the Army's Silas, would have had a use. A man who can find anyone can also stop anyone if he's willing to do it the Army's way. There were 9 in that survey party with their escort, and a hard man who knew the country could have thinned them in the rocks and turned them back in fear, and not one soul in the hollow would have called it wrong. Hesse, I think, half expected it of him, half hoped for it. It would have been the soldier's answer, the professional's answer, the answer the whole of Silas Crowder's life had trained him toward. He didn't give it. He'd put that belt in the dirt years before, and he was not going to pick it up again, not even for the people he loved, because he understood. And this is the wisdom the whole sorry trade had finally bought him, that you cannot protect a thing you love by becoming the thing that threatens it. So he used the edge the other way. He went to Atok and Nikoma and Hesi and Tali, and he laid the country out for them flat and true, every fold of it, the way only he could, where the crew was, where they'd be, the one pass they'd have to take and the two they'd never find. And then the people of that hollow made their own plan, with Silas's eyes for the land laid at their service like a tool set down on the table for whoever needed it. They didn't run and they didn't fight. They did something harder and smarter than either. With Silas reading the survey crew's mind off their tracks the way he'd once read it for the army, telling Atok when they'd rest, when they'd push, where they'd lose heart, the band quietly closed the only pass that led into the hollow. Not with guns, with the land, a turned-aside game trail, a washed-out look given to a sound stretch of bank. A blind drawn across a country so that 9 tired men with a deadline read it exactly as Silas told them they would, and decided on their own that there was nothing up that draw worth the trouble, and turned their map and their road and their guns toward easier country, and never knew there'd been 40 people and 400 years of wintering just over the rise. No shot was fired. No blood was spilled. The finest tracker on the plains saved Sweetgrass Hollow by making it disappear, which is the only kind of victory that leaves everybody alive to grow old, and the only kind worth a damn. I had it later from Hesi himself, the morning the survey smoke was seen going away south instead of coming on. Hesi stood beside the man he'd wanted dead the winter before and watched the threat turn and dwindle, and he was quiet a long time, and then he said something to Silas in his own tongue. Tali told me much later what it was. He said, "I was wrong about your eyes." And then, because Hesi was an honest man and a fair one, he said the harder thing too. He said, "You are still not one of us, but you are not nothing to us either, and my sister was right to climb the mountain." It was not a blessing. It was better than a blessing because it was earned and it was true. Tali married him the following spring, and I want to be plain about that word, because the world will hear it wrong and I won't have it. She chose him. It was her choice, made freely in her own time, by her own light, not granted to him by an elder as a reward for services rendered, not handed over the way the cheap stories hand a woman over to whatever man has done the most shooting. There is none of that here. Atok did not give her to Silas. Nikoma did not promise her. Tali, a grown woman who had hauled this man off a mountain and watched him refuse to become a killer for her sake, and decided across 2 long winters that she would have him and no other, Tali decided. And then her people, who loved her, honored the decision she had made, which is a different thing entirely and the only decent thing. Hesi stood with her when she made it. That, more than anything else in the whole story, is how I know the man had truly come over to the right side of his own life. They built a place where the 2 worlds touched, not in the hollow, which was hers and her people's and no place for a white man to plant himself, and not down at the ford, which was mine and the soldiers, and no place to ask her to live among the kind that had hunted her kin. They built up Cedar Creek, on the old trapping ground in the borderland, with 1 foot in each country and a door that opened to both. She kept her healing work and her people came to her, and in the bad years that followed, and there were bad years, I'll not pretend the world got kind. Silas Crowder's gift for reading the country ahead kept more than 1 band a step in front of more than 1 column, quiet and unmarked and alive. He never picked the belt up again. He never had to. It turned out a man who knows where the soldiers are can do a great deal of good simply by knowing it first, and saying so, and never once raising his hand. I sat at their fire many a night in the years that were left to me. I watched the gray come fully into Silas's hair and the stillness finally leave his eyes, that stillness I told you about, the held-breath stillness of a man afraid to look at his own hands. It went in the end. It was replaced by something I'd never thought to see on him, which was the plain tiredness of a man with too much to do and people who needed him to do it, the good tiredness, the kind a man earns and is grateful for. I'd catch him watching Tali at her work across the firelight on her hands, and there'd be a look on his face that I can only call wonder. The wonder of a man who'd been certain, lying frozen in a snowbank, that he was getting exactly what he deserved, and who'd been wrong, gloriously and undeservedly wrong, and who never once stopped knowing how wrong he'd been or how lucky. He said a thing to me our last winter that I've kept. We were old by then, the both of us. He was sitting with his bad leg stretched to the fire. It ached him in the cold his whole life after, that leg, and he never complained of it once, said it was the cheapest thing he ever bought, and Tally was in the next room and we could hear her, and he was quiet a while in the old way, and then he said, "All those years, Bram, they called me the finest tracker on the plains, best in the world at finding people." He looked at his hands then, the way he never used to be able to. "I never found a single thing worth keeping until the day I got so lost I couldn't find my own back trail, and then somebody found me." That's the whole of it. That's the story they tell wrong around the ford to this day, the great Silas Crowder, the man who could follow anybody across bare rock in the dark, buried in a snowbank and saved by a woman from the valley. They tell it like a curiosity. They don't know the size of it. They don't know that the finest tracker on the plains spent his whole life finding the wrong things for the wrong reasons, and that the one trail he ever truly needed was the one he couldn't read, the one that ran out under him in the snow, and that the mercy of it, the everlasting mercy of it, was that the reading of that last trail was never his to do. It was hers. She climbed the mountain. She did not have to, and she did. And the man she carried down, it lived 40 more years, a husband and a friend, and a quiet keeper of other people's safety, and died in his own bed in the borderland with her hand in his, an old man who had finally, after a whole hard life of finding, been found.